We can start.
Hello everyone. We welcome everyone to second session of third day of undergraduate dissertation symposium. Hi, I am Milind Mahle and I teach here at C. We have this session titled as Transience and Home. We will have three presentations from the panelists, which will be 10 minutes each and 30 minutes total. Further, we will open up the discussion with discussant for about 40 minutes and take questions from the audience. We have a three discussant with us. Sarovar Zaidi, Assistant Professor at Jindal School of Art and Architecture. Prasad Professor of Geography at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Guwahati. And Dr. Kush Patel, Associate Professor of Architecture and Humanities at Avni Institute of Design. In this session, we have a three student presenter, Sanika Kedar, Maitreyi Moge, and Sagar Shekokar. As this session is titled Transience and Home, all of them will be talking about home and stories. Sanika will talk about home and nomadic life, whereas Maitreyi will talk about the runaway from context to make a new home. And Sagar will be speaking about the home away from home, mainly in reference to the non-local students. With this, I would like to start presentation, Home in Transience. Sanika?
Yeah. Hi, this is Sanika, and I will present my thesis titled Home in Transience. I started with the hypothesis that the idea of home for nomadic tribe differs from the group who settled in a place, including migrant workers, over long periods of time. The question that arises is why did humans start settling when nomads still keep migrating? The idea of home for migrants differ from group to group. Some groups are settled in place for longer periods, which may also include migrant workers. The other type of groups is nomadic tribes, which constantly move from a place to another seasonally or monthly. These communities are associated with a wide range of traditional livelihood activities like animal husbandry, craftswork, gathering medicinal herbs, entertainment, and music. There are segments of nomadic tribes that still practice nomadism in Vidarbh region of Maharashtra. One such example is the tribal migrants from Irghat region in Amravati districts. Many of these migrants migrate to Nagpur district to work in orange farms. The season lasts for 5 to 6 months, and for that period of time, they don't have any place to stay, and thus start building small tents on the roadside or on the fields, where they live with their families for a specific amount of time till harvest. After the season ends, they migrate to some other place for work. Sedentary society always look at them as homeless because they lack a permanent habitation. They inhabit the walls, bridges, pavements, and other similar unused spaces of the city. But in reality, they have appropriated the infrastructure in the city to build a home for themselves. These migrants are so mobile that within a few months, they shift to some other place and create a new home at a new place. In this dissertation, I argue that the home for nomadic groups differ from groups of people who live in permanent society. The aim of the study aims to excavate the spatial association of home that are practiced by nomads, to explore and learn from the nomadic idea of home in the contemporary ways of making homes. Stepping aside from the sedentary settlements, this study will try to understand the nomadic practice and notion of home as an alternative way of imagining human life and habitat. The research objective is to map and analyze the idea of home and house for nomadic groups and the relationship between its transience and spatiality. And the research question is, what is an idea of home for nomadic tribes and how does transience shape its spatiality? To explore this question, I arrived at following operational concepts and studied them, which are nomad, home, household, and life form. Some authors have exclusively covered the notion of home and house. Most of them compare the idea of home for a nomad to the settled society. The authors suggest that the space in settled society are enclosed by walls. The settled society is somehow always looking for permanence, and because it is enclosed by boundaries, the idea of privacy comes in. The next question that comes to mind is when and how did the idea of home come up? And why do we always consider home as a permanent entity? The settled society derived the idea of permanent home from the idea of property, the idea of reservation, and it becomes an asset. The permanent home is an idea of wealth. They recognized the private property gave people a reason to plant roots in one place and invent farming and thus started settling. Sedentarism and territoriality go together. By contrast, the nomadic trajectory does the opposite. It distributes people in an open space, one that is indefinite. The tribes saw the world without the roofs and barricades. They don't have this idea of wealth or owning a property. The entire world for them was one, and they moved in and around its niches, following the demands of their lifestyle. Otto Bollnow, in his book Lived Spaces, says that one of the characteristics of a house is related to the difference between inner and outer space, and then stating another characteristic, that is the threshold, and how the idea of threshold is associated with home. The notion of home is also limited to enclosures and boundaries. But the home for nomad is not just the enclosure where she sleeps at night or keeps their belonging. It also includes the journey from place to another, the temporary settlements, objects and belongings they carry, the land on which they build their house. There is no distinct inside and outside. The materiality of the space makes it more temporal. They dismantle their house, pack them, and then carry them to other places. Nomads usually use locally sourced material to construct temporary dwellings adapted to suit both the climate and specific needs of the tribe. Houses are built using materials available in the area. They don't have any native place because they are constantly on the move. They may have a story of origin, the place where they have lived before journeying, but they do not have a place to which they return after traveling for some months. Uh, the unit of studies are the three different cases of nomadic tribes in Amravati city of Maharashtra. The methods of collecting data included taking detailed interviews, making drawings, photographs, and voice notes. The drawings will be a montage of movements and partial settlings. They will illustrate nomadic journeys, energies, and temporary settlements. It would be led with what is the notion of home for nomad is. It is a time-space narrative that is creating geographies of home in transience. The different aspects of work, play, and life come together. Uh, uh, so, this is one of the nomadic family which I interviewed in June. It is a Dhangal family from Dhani Taluka in Amravati district. It is family of 7, a husband, 2 wives, and 4 children. It is a goat keeping pastoral family which used to practice shifting cultivation in northeastern part of Maharashtra. The family annually migrates in Vidarbha region. It once owned 7 goats and 2 cows. They migrated from farm to another farm and to work and to find grazing spot for their cattle. The family now works as a laborer in paddy fields in Maharashtra region, where they set up their tents on the field itself. The tent is made of bamboo and tarpaulin sheets, which is very easy to set up and dismantle. Uh, and they dismantle it when they need to migrate. The family then migrates to cotton field. The family then migrates to cotton farms in Amravati district. Cotton requires 6 to 8 months to mature, and thus family stays in cotton field for that period of time with their cattle, where they set up the tent. They migrate to Amravati city for 3 to 4 months after Diwali, where they live on the footpath under the bridge. On the occasion of Diwali, they visit every shop in the main market to perform their traditional dance and sing. The family cooks, eats, work, and sleep at the same footpath. The interesting thing is how they appropriate the footpath according to their need and occupation. The women in the family cooks and then set up their small shop on the footpath itself. The drawing shows the annual routine of family. Um, it collapses the geographies, times, and dynamics of the space. Uh, this is the second case study. This is a family of 5 which belong to the Mang Garudi caste. The family's original occupation is snake charming. Most of them have lost their job because of the new fertilizers. So the agrarian world doesn't require their service anymore. So they are pushed back to the forest. And their desire to earn more has increased. So they keep coming back and negotiating with the settled society, looking for alternatives of earning. Now they work in farm as laborers. Some of them are in Ayurveda business, which is from their tribal knowledge, and they mobilize it in the market. There is an interesting shift in the historic interaction with agriculture-based society. The drawing shows the journey of the family from the fields to the city. This is the whole drawing. This is the third nomadic family which I interviewed. It is a group of 3 Pardi families. The drawing shows how the family occupies space and how the landscape becomes the homes. The The drawings aim at understanding the nomadic practice and notion of a home as a way of imagining human life and habitat. I will conclude the research with following 4 points. First is dynamics of space. The home for nomad is characterized by constant change, activity, and progress. They are so mobile that within a few months they shift to some other place and create a new home at a new place. The use of space changes according to their need. Second is idea of temporality. Nomads have no idea of permanent building. There is no distinct inside and outside. The materiality of the space makes it more temporal. They dismantle their house, pack them, and then carry them to other places. The third is idea of landscape. The drawing shows that the home for nomad is not just the enclosure where they sleep at night or keep their belonging. It is the landscape that includes the journey from place to another, the temporary settlements, objects they carry with them, and the land on which they build their houses, the transaction and networks to the neighborhood. The fourth is idea of improvisation and appropriations. Nomads usually use a locally sourced material to construct temporary dwellings adapted to suit both climate and specific needs of the tribe. Houses are built using materials available in the area. Uh, because of these reasons, there is a shift in the idea of home. There is no idea of permanency. The spatiality that emerges from there is beyond our idea of home. And it need not to be a 1 or 2 BHK house. The nomad speaks about how the landscape can be a house and how it can be made on daily basis, and therefore there is no permanence. So for the design process, there is a possibility of creating places which have high affordances because they will provide opportunities for people to come, live, and move, and rethink the idea of standard home and its partiality. The research also presents a possibility and pleasure of mobile homes, the ones that can be dismantled, moved, and carried, the home that can be made on daily basis, which allows the transformation and reconfiguration to take place. I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanika. Thank you very much. Now I will ask Maitri to give her presentation, which is titled as Making Home of Runways and Escape Stories. Maitri?
Yes, thank you, Millie. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Hello, my name is Maitri. I will be presenting my thesis titled as Making Home of Runaway and Escape Stories. When the lockdown was announced due to the virus spread, an entire nation was locked into the houses. Entire community of people headed back to their respective residential places from where they belonged. While walking down the street, I happened to talk to few street vendors along the road edge of my neighborhood who stayed out on the carts and temporary shelters near the footpath. Later, it was discovered that they were the runaways who escaped from their earlier homes to the new context for certain motives to achieve. Then I started thinking about when do people run away and from what to gain a better life? How do people who have run away from one context to another find comfort out of their comfort zone? What does it take to convert something into your home? What are the special problems while shifting our context to a new one? Hence, this thesis will help me understand how do people who have run away from one context to another make their home. While understanding the term escape, it was discovered that it's a runaway from our own context to an unknown place to achieve or to get rid of something. As Gregory David Roberts says in the book Shantaram, when we change our context, temporality becomes permanent. The aim of the thesis is to understand the role of context while escaping or relocating certain space. So, to map the relationship between the escape of a runaway life and its partiality, I interacted with various people changing their context by running away from their earlier one. Each case is studied through 3 lenses, which are a psyche of a runaway person, where I have explored how one imagines his or her life in the realm of imagination, memory, and reality. Second is escape, where I have mapped how memories and past life experiences play a role after shifting the context. And third is spatiality, in which I have mapped how runaway person claim and appropriate the new space to make his home. The phase was started by looking at different types of people around my neighborhood who have changed their context for various reasons. Through the cases, which include a virtual game addict, a cyber scam victim, and an illegitimate child. Given the context of COVID 19 quarantine, the central characters of my cases are the friends or people discovered through the contacts who had chosen to run away from their earlier home. I conducted several informal, unstructured conversations with them through telephone and video calls to understand the psyche, escape, and spatiality of their life. This is where books building stories pushes what is expected from storytelling and comic. The idea of a space, when converted into the comic, makes the book feel more like a book of treasures. By taking the references of various graphic novels, I analyzed these conversations and translated them into the form of fictional graphic novel. The visual and textual stories in my graphic novel helped me advance the various learnings in my dissertation. One of my cases starts in the outskirts of Mumbai city, where one boy who stayed in the residential apartment with his family faced the issue of a privacy in his own house and hence got involved in a virtual game for an escape. This drawing shows the various activities of the boy in and around of his house and school and how he started getting detached with the home and family. Hence, he discovered the entire community of gaming where he found his space for himself. He ran away in search of personal space, and he ended up in an urban city where the houses are glued together, sharing a common wall in between, keeping less space to breathe, and the boundaries between public and private spaces are blurred. While adjusting and setting up his life in new contexts, gaming became his everyday escape. By gathering people virtually, he generated his personal space. While struggling to find a place to stay, various people crossed his way and helped him out on different stages. For example, getting access of his internet cafe for the shelter, getting to work for a restaurant to earn the food, or accommodating the buffer space under the street shop to rest in between his working shifts. He mobilized sympathetic kinship and friendship networks to secure food, livelihood, and housing in the new context. The second case started in the rural area of Konkan region, where the villagers are like the extended family who get involved in every family issue. This is the story of a girl who gets involved in a digital media trap. Her huge house with a big courtyard in the center of the is in the center of the village and joint family to stay along with. And somehow she became a victim of a digital scam, due to which she thought of disappearing from there to avoid her relatives and villagers. When she was attacked by the cyber bullies, she was away from her home. She ran away from her home to place to the place where no one would know her existence. She came to a metropolitan city with the help of her aunt, where everyone was busy in their own life. The spatial change did question her about the escape she made for herself, although her neighborhood helped her cope up with the new context. Even though she ran away to avoid human interface, she had to interact with neighborhood that she came to live in after her escape, because that became the source of new networks to her to better her life chances in terms of daily wages or arranging food, water, and sanitation facilities. It was seen that different life needs go hand in hand. Third case is located in the outskirts of Mumbai city, where there was an illegitimate child who was who never experienced what is the idea of a family is, and his existence was always questioned by the natives. The boy was victim of peer bullying in school and hence tried to get away with it by escaping from his guardians to find a life away from harassment and negligence. Here we can see different kinds of days in his initial times in the city. To sustain alone in the unknown city became a nightmare for him. By growing new friendship, he developed a sense of new social life, where he was forced to talk to new people for living. From staying alone under the bridge and begging for the food to staying in a factory with a group of people to work and chat with, it is seen that new networks lead to the new conversations which play an important role in the making of a home. Informal interactions might introduce to the spontaneous life shifts which will better our life chances. These informal conversations take place generally in the transitional areas which are not assigned with the determined operational use in the neighborhood, where the breaks between the work are taken together, stories about life and aspirations are exchanged, investment are forged together in a group, etc. The transitional space are found in staircases, the front yards of buildings, auto rickshaws parked next to the compounds or parapet walls along the road edge, informal chai shops and road junctions, etc. Runaway's life thus represents a new spatiality where making of home emerges in an ecology of transitional spaces in the neighborhood where associations are forged. These home is thus not only the unit in which they reside, but all those spaces that afford the possibilities of new social networks that allow them to have a better life chances. This dissertation therefore provides pointers for the need to mobilize design questions on housing in the realm of porosity in the physical spaces of neighborhood, transitional spaces, and ecology of associational spaces that make home.
Thank you, Maitri. Interesting stories about the escapes. Now I would ask Sagar to present his presentation, which is titled Home Away from Home. Sagar? Sagar, are you there?
Yeah, just a minute.
Yeah, Sagar.
Is it visible?
Yes, you can start now.
So my research title is Home Away from Home. Here I'm trying to study how non-local students make home in cities that they study in, and understand the complexities that are involved in shaping the space they inhabit. Uh, there has been increased migration of students in recent past within the country, especially to cities. It's crucial to understand how students make home in cities as they experience a transition from their parental home to a new city. The idea of home that they carried with them changes drastically as they have become self-dependent. They seek shelter in a rented term time accommodation like hostels, paying guests, and shared apartments. Regardless of the type of accommodation a student chooses, there is a struggle to find homeliness in these term time accommodations. It can be simply viewed as it can't be simply viewed as different people living together. Student accommodations can be a more complex living environment than other shared living spaces, in that their arrangement comprises the performance of multiple and heterogeneous actors in a single space. Understanding the dynamics of student housing means recognizing the multiple iterations of home that exist within them. In this research, I'm trying to understand how these multiple ideas of home coexist, and thus various acts of making a home by the students can be seen. It's also necessary to understand how different behavioral patterns coexist and shape space. So, a student accommodation becomes a home away from home, but it can be seen as it can be seen that such spaces follow a linear and mundane spatial configuration. Such spaces are complex living environments where multiple ideas rather than people share the space, but these are still treated more like prisons for students, where the individual identity of idea of home is lost. It is necessary to take a sensitive approach towards understanding students' home by engaging it as a lived space in which students make, organize, and perform social interactions. Uh, the research aim is to develop and explore possibilities of homemaking in a term time accommodation to understand how different ideas rather than people come together, trying to fit in and give a new meaning to the space. For the research method, 10 interviews were conducted to understand the behavioral patterns that affect how these young adults shape their space and put together their acts of making home. 5 pairs of roommates were interviewed belonging to different term time accommodations. Participants were asked about their idea of home, their initial and current perception about their stay in the term time accommodations, how their idea of home and idea of how their ideas of making a home differed from the fellow occupants, and about their memorable experiences. Out of 10 interviews, 6 were used for the research due to overlap and insufficient or irrelevant data. I'm using a series of narrative drawings as a visual language to document their behavioral patterns and spatial experiences. Each drawing talks about how these young adults make, organize, perform social interactions within their term time living environments. Uh, so, for the first interview, as we start setting into a new place and push constantly to become engaged, our perception of the space changes with time. The place which feels daunting initially can be perceived differently once it becomes familiar. For Rohini, the sense of congestion became apparent inside and outside the room due to her initial phase. During her initial phase after moving to Mumbai, the common spaces like the common spaces like TV hall or gym became important gathering spots that encouraged social interactions. That transition became apparent when a student shifts to another place. An accommodation with some authority will have certain restrictions compared to a space like a shared apartment, which gives freedom to make it function 24/7. Class hierarchies can be seen in some of the accommodations. Higher the rent, more the privacy. The cheaper rooms are generally larger, open, and cater to more occupants. This sometimes creates differences and sense of division amongst the occupants. Unlike her roommate, Ashwini shows pretty contradicting behavioral patterns. Moving from her parental house was a big step towards getting a sense of freedom. Her idea of home was not just limited to hostel or the hostel campus, but it expanded to the surroundings, to the chowpatty. It became a second home to her as she took her work and leisure activities there. Getting familiar with the surroundings strengthened her idea of home. So the outdoors became more of a home for her than the hostel itself. Uh, for Rahul, his idea of home expanded outside the four walls to the hostel campus, but remained inside the defined boundaries of the campus. Various outdoor activities were shifted inside, which created a sense of homeliness and togetherness. Some spaces were reimagined. Uh, the corridors often became a play area or an important gathering space to socialize. Sometimes the communal living can become uh, a compromise with one's privacy. Certain boundaries feel necessary once they are breached. For Rahul, having too many friends around became a nuisance for him, where it was hard to get a sense of privacy. Institutional accommodation often restrict various activities, and that's where we see students creating temporary spaces within the boundaries, always in constant fear of getting caught. Rahul talks about how his study table often became a temporary kitchen and a storage area for the groceries under his bed. Access to the stairs was restricted, but they used it in the early morning for jogging when the warden was absent. Uh, some students prefer living in a non-institutional accommodation for freedom that they get. For Dhananjay, things weren't the same when he moved to the hostel due to certain circumstances. The institutional accommodation always have some authority which sets specific guidelines for the inhabitants. Young adults filled with sense of rebellion try to overlook these restrictions and find their find their own ways to create a space as they see fit. Students try to create flexible spaces in terms of time and activities. Various spaces become multi-purpose as Dhananjay with his friend devised a way to access the building 24/7. The acts could be as subtle as keeping indoor plants inside the rooms or climbing the terrace. Most of these acts are of making home, especially in presence of an authority, involves rebellious behaviors, which indirectly tries to show us the inadequacies of student homes. Uh, Living in a shared accommodation is about adjusting with different people with different behavioral patterns. How one uses a space affects the other. For Poonam, her living in a rented apartment with her roommates was about constant disagreements. Her roommates, having their friends most of the time, isolated her and restricted her freedom inhabiting the space. Again, the idea of defined functionality is challenged when Urvashi and her hostel mates reimagine the space. The rooms made to cater to two occupants can become a common gathering spot to socialize. The larger corridors were imagined as tracks for night strolls, and the stairs became the sitting area for the canteen. So to conclude, by discussion of the youthful homes, this research has argued for the recognition of complex and social and spatial configurations of shared student properties. In doing so, it highlights how habitualized behaviors are performed and negotiated, and how this can influence spatial configuration of boundaries within student homes. Some larger patterns can be culled out from these interviews, which include spaces that increase the chances of familiarizing yourself with other inhabitants, which would include uh, uh, common spaces of multiple scales, spaces with different degree of openness and access to the surroundings, spaces of for togetherness, possibilities of creating private spaces or boundaries and limits, one's own kitchen, spaces to take walks, enjoy the breeze, watch the sunset, spaces to gather in someone's room, less hierarchy, more freedom, places to party, places of security, and possibilities of personalization. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah, thank you.
So it was very interesting to idea of home, all of these three, and which is definitely it's going very much away from that permanence of the home, and it's dealing with the different degrees of temporality which is coming into picture. Sanika's work tries to understand what nomadic life is, what is the notion of home in terms of imagining human life and habitat. This work pushes us to rethink the idea of home with its various tenets, such as inside, outside, idea of property, inhabitation, and all. Whereas Maitreyi's work dwells in a realm of in between. It's about the in between space, which define the porosity in the physical space of neighborhoods. Swagat work focuses on the idea of home as the possibilities of imagining the permanence of making home, to explore how students articulate the idea of homemaking in temporal shared term, time, and accommodations. So basically all of them are somehow directing us towards the idea of home, and for us, which was which deals with the permanence of the home. But now here in this all of them, they are very much talking about temporary in various degrees, and very interesting ideas which is coming up, and the stories to understand. With that, I will ask our three respondents to uh, give their views about the presentations. Can I call Kush maybe to go first?
Thank you. Thanks, Milind. Thank you, students. Sanika, Maitreyi, Swagat, enjoyed your presentations. Some of them were quite difficult stories to listen to, and so I think one of my immediate questions would be, how did you go about even thinking about the groups of people who would be the narrators and the subjects of your inquiry? So that's one question that's across. And so for Sanika, you did three cases that you presented. One was you call them nomads. So one is the quote unquote groupings of snake charmers. The other one is a Pahari family. And the first one, could you just recall?
Pardi.
Sorry,
Pardi.
Pardi family. And the first one was which one?
Dhangar.
The Dhankar family, yeah. So it's interesting that you provide us with these vignettes of where they are, how they move, where they find themselves in the context of what we call a city, and the sort of the very material vocabulary that travels with them. In Maitri's case, an interesting choice of the graphic novel as a medium to tell a story, which is so much at the level of the individual, right? So whether it's the virtual game addict or it's a cyber scam victim, again, interesting choice of genders there. In some ways, reproducing the tropes, but also then one is able to sort of at least travel with you. But I was quite intrigued by the choice of gender of how the virtual game addict is often a young male, cis male, and the cyber scam victim is always a woman. And then you have this illegitimate child, again, thinking through questions of illegitimacy as ascribed by whom in a society, as defined by whom. And Swagat, this idea of home away from home, so many of us have lived in hostels, in paying guest facilities, in ideas of shared accommodations by choice, but also sometimes by compulsion based on the circumstances we find ourselves. So you also kind of touched upon questions of both class and gender, explicitly or implicitly in your narrative, because that was coming through very clearly. So I think the way I was looking at your presentations is one, Sanika, if there is a kind of a relationship to be mapped, that was, for me, it was between possession and dispossession. And how does one navigate that spectrum of possession and dispossession in the making of a habitat? For Maitri, I was thinking through this continuum of privacy and publicity, and the navigation along that spectrum in the making of, or rather longing for a certain kind of permanence, which is not permanence as defined by a home, but permanence for a support system, a kind of a kinship network that would allow one to still feel settled, quote unquote settled, but at least not settled, but supported perhaps in the context in which one finds oneself. And Swagat, for you, as I said, it was class and gender and the roles that they play in transgressing boundaries. Although for Swagat, I really wanted to sort of hear more about what those transgressions have meant, other than transgressions or kinds of adjustments or rebellions, as you call them, within the context of the flat or the shared accommodation. I was thinking of the larger transgressions, or what does it mean for two women to even begin to occupy a space, cohabit in the context of a city, or for a group of boys to come together, and then how do you not flatten out these genders? Is what, having stayed in a boys' hostel, it's interesting that even there are boys and there are boys, because issues of class, gender, sexuality, all of that plays out, and I was sort of longing for a much more fine-grained understanding of that, in thinking through that. For some people, home away from home is always home suspended because one is never fully settled. And likewise for Sanika, I wanted to sort of have a much more fine-grained understanding of the social roles that each of these nomadic groups that you have selected for your project in the making, moving, dismantling, and ultimately even squatting in the city. And that I really was wanting to sort of hear more about. It's not just a group of people who are moving from farmlands to becoming temporary workers to ultimately squatting and then finding themselves as laboring in the city. But what is the role of gender in the making of one's habitat? Because that plays a crucial role in sort of thinking through, again, who, not just what we make, but also how we make and who makes what we make. And for you, Maitri, it was the question for me was, yes, the virtual game addict has run away from or escaping because it's first of all, you're calling it an addiction, right? So there's already kind of a value judgment. There's an addiction as defined by home. And somewhere they're finding themselves in a metropolitan space because the ubiquity and the anonymity that this metropolitan city offers, but ultimately finding themselves supported by other gamers. And so I wanted to sort of hear more about what is the lived in habitation of gamers as they find themselves in a city. So how does one zoom out, but also zoom back in to be able to say that they're gamers and they're gamers, but this is a geography of gamers as they come together to occupy a city. And whether or not the escape narrative always works with them, maybe not. But then there's something about that creates a new world and a kind of a new material form. Also, one of the points I wanted to make with regards to this idea of nomad itself. I was initially quite troubled as to you start with this binary of humans wanting to settle, and then there are groups that are perennially nomadic. But there is neither an invocation of the very colonizing taxonomy associated with groups being called nomads, or even a very casteist taxonomy with groups being kept as nomads or quote unquote undesirables in the context of the city. So I just wanted to sort of encourage you to rethink some of these categories that we've inherited as our vocabulary in the context of who's a nomad and who's settled, and then say, but there are deep colonizing casteist trajectories which they're suspending this very idea of settling for some groups of people. They don't even have the choice. And if they don't have the choice, where is the dignity? So I think the question for you was the architecture of dignity, or the making of dignity, and how does one hold on to? So even though you may not materially possess anything, what is it that you are carrying with you, or aspiring to constantly settle with? And how, in what ways is the city constantly taking that away from you, or providing or sort of establishing certain boundary conditions that make it impossible for that dignity of that community to be held? So I think no matter how nomadic, there's something that everybody holds on to. No matter how strongly you want to escape, to run away from some kind of a reality, there's something that you're aspiring to hold on to. And Swagat, no matter how further away you may be from the idea of home, the cohabitation is not neutral. And it's not just about a group of boys cohabiting or a group of girls cohabiting, but there are issues of gender, class, sexuality that make it even more problematic. And sometimes one may even want to move away from this idea of home away from home. So that's where I want to sort of pause here as an invitation to think about transience, right? Because that's the theme of this segment. The transience is transience by virtue of it being framed sometimes by people with privilege and a certain kind of vocabulary. And then transience is a transience by virtue of it being claimed and reclaimed by people who are actually either escaping, moving, navigating, squatting, or even choosing to settle as and when they could. So, yeah. Thank you.
I think Kush has asked on behalf of all of us. A lot of those things he's covered. Thank you.
Thank you, Kush. Prasad, you want to go?
So, I mean, they're all three very interesting sort of starting points and projects, both in terms of the kind of questions they're asking, the kind of studies that you've taken up of individuals or families. And in all three, what I was missing, and I'm kind of surprised to say this myself, is that I was actually missing architectural stories, because these stories about people, right, about individuals, about families moving from one place to the other, or individuals who are moving houses, right? And what I wasn't able to actually get a sense of, and which is where I feel like, for the next step, architecture strategy becomes important is, what are the architecture stories that come out of it, right? Which I felt sort of missing, and it was clear in Swagat's drawing because the body is colored while the room and everything is sort of just the line, right? And which leads me to the second point is that in all of them, because of the transience and mobility, the body itself also becomes a very strong aspect of mobility, right? In many ways, the body itself also becomes an architectural object, right? There's a sense of like the body itself becomes like an infrastructural thing that is constantly moving and attaching itself to different spaces, right? So you have the body, and then it starts extending itself to find affordances in cities and different kinds of spaces, attaching itself in different ways. So what are these, how does the body attach itself to these beds or to these, transient spaces? What is the architecture of these extensions and, plugins and sort of, that architecture story is somewhere I found missing at this point, right? It's a story of a larger narrative of their lives, but the architecture story of how they move and sort of, move is something that is, I felt was absent at this point. And that requires a little more detailing out, right? This relationship between the body and one place and the second place and third place, right? What happens to the beds? Is it just an architecture of beds, right? In the third case, is it, so when a family is moving, and the body is not necessarily a neutral body, right? Like how Kushal is saying, it's a gendered, caste, age, all of that is also associated with it. But it's still, sorry, what? Oh. So it's kind of a moving body that is attaching. So, what is the architecture of the body? What is it attaching itself to? What is it carrying with it? How does a body of a family change as compared to an individual person? So those relationships is something that I was actually looking for in terms of the study that, the architecture study that you've done. Right? And in some sense, I felt that, then the question of home might be asked very differently, or maybe you don't want to ask about the question of a home, right? You might want to just, because in some cases when they are running away, the home is not necessarily what they want, right? They want the thinking about, and this goes back to the idea of the type, is that for individuals who sort of, running away from the home, they're looking for a different kind of an architectural type, right? Not necessarily an idea for home, right? It might be a, I don't know, like the name is, this is where your architectural invention and what you want to call it kind of comes in, right? So largely thinking about the body itself as also an architectural form, how it, attaches and mediates itself and kind of moves, right? What happens in those transitory periods from one place to the other, right? What is that? How do they move from one place to the other? What is it? A bus? Is it a train? What are they carrying with them? How do they, escape? Right? What allows them to escape? What is the architecture of this escape also? Right? Because you're looking at points where they actually settle rather than also the transience in between, right? Because if you are talking about transience, what is the architecture of the transience? Is it simply the body, or is it the other things architecturally that are involved? And so what, if one is talking about this constant movement, what does a light, right? Not a sense of permanence, but a light architecture look like, right? Which allows you to constantly move, right? Like architecture, if it's about rooting and foundations, that is where the settling comes in. What does a light architecture look like? Yeah, what does a mobile light architecture look like? Okay, I'll stop there.
Sarovar?
Actually, I think between Prasad and Kush, they have covered most of the things. But I think this was a very interesting set. And I also want to, I really think it has a very interesting comparison to the last session also, whereas there is a sense of homing and movement in the homing ideas. And I agree with Kush when we talk. I mean, I think nomadism as a term in itself has its own history, and nomadic tribes have their own history. So you'll have to see, are we using the term in its kind of genealogy of anthropology or government nomadic tribes way, or are we talking about nomadism of form and movement? And I mean, like, nearly everybody, I think, who lives in different cities, or especially cities like Bombay, has at least, I shifted about 10 houses in Bombay in 10 years. And I've shifted about 7 houses here. So what is, then are you thinking of it as a concept? And that applies to, very interestingly, to all three of you, about nomadism as an idea, and this notion of movement, adaptation, and homing. How do people make, even, what we were discussing in the last session about refugees, about what Rohit was talking about making a life in a place, when he mentioned in the end. So how you home in a place, even though you have the sense of being either a refugee or someone who's from the outside. And I think Bombay offers that very interesting thing of everybody is from outside, but now we have made a life here. And making a life here means something like homing here. And you might be still shifting 20 houses, and you might be shifting between the outer layers of Dharavi to the inner parts of Dharavi, or or moving between from Borivali to Kandivali to Kalina, like I did, or whatever. So there's this, so there are these ways constantly arriving and homing in your nomadism. Hmm? And that again goes to this thing of the outsider in the city, the refugee, the nomad, the migrant laborer, and all these things. And I think that is something that all of you have thought about or seen in all your three presentations, whether it is the boys or the room, hostel room, coming to a big city.
Losing you, Sarovar. We're losing you.
Right next to my router.
I think your hand is on the mic.
The mic is kind of moving.
Oh, okay. I'll have to hold my laptop up. Okay, sorry. Is it better now?
Yeah.
So I think that's very interesting that all three of you go into this kind of unraveling of thinking of how people inhabit and home in the frame of transience. And I think it will be nice for you to reflect on this. I'm not going to give specific comments per se, but of course for Sanika, I do want you to think about the binary that you worked with on the nomadic families of Amravati. How is the nomadic family of Amravati different from maybe your neighbor's family in Bombay? Maitrey, I really liked your idea, or the thing that you talked about in the video game and the runaway. And again, it connects to, I think, Heron's presentation on escape and forms of escape. And that again builds itself back to this thing that we are talking about escape to the big city. So is all and I actually really liked Kush's point about this thing where he said, is there a choice or is there not? And yet if I and yes, there are lots of people who don't actually have a choice but to move in these forms. And then there are people for whom escape is the entrances to new life forms, to be able to live a certain kind of lifestyle, in the sense, personal choices, choices of sexuality, choices of um, moral choice, whatever, I don't know, lots of stuff that you can do. And I think that there is always this edge of escape built into, and nomadism built into each person's form of living. I mean, this one of the things that all of you must have experienced is, you go to college and now you're sitting at home, and just taking a train across 4 stations is a form of then escape too, right? Just I think your presentation, the second one, sorry, my name game is very bad. Maitrey. And also how people make homes in those transition spaces. If you are a regular of a particular time in the Bombay train, there are people who have this whole world that they kind of
Lost you again.
invent. Hmm. And that getting displaced is also feeling displaced. Yeah, my time on the train, like there was a time in my life when I was in Bombay.
Sarovar,
we can't.
Sarovar.
Oh my god,
Oh,
okay,
sorry.
fine.
Your hand is again on mic. Maybe I don't know.
I don't
It's
even know whether
volume
this is
goes
my
very low inside.
so escape, sorry, and the transition space as the home is what I was talking about vis-a-vis the train. And I think there are some people who, between a work life and a home life, the one place you home is those 33 minutes on the train. You could, or you feel like, okay. And there's a kind of familiarity in non-familiarity zone also. And it's also about routines and routes and stuff like that. So it'll be interesting for you to explain, especially because you're looking at this idea of the runway. So can the runaway space, can the road be a home? Um, and for Swagat, I think it'll be interesting for you to think about you mentioned this thing about hostel means giving a personal privacy to a certain level. I think most people at the level at the age of 18 would prefer to give up the personal privacy of a hostel space than live at home with their parents. I mean, I'm just speculating. But so what are the ideas of freedom that you can think of in these forms of homing and nomadism? And here I mean nomadism not in a anthro way, but in a kind of a idea of movement. Yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you, Sarovar. Now I would ask participants to respond, maybe in the same order, Shanika, Maitri, and Swagat. Shanika?
So, as Kush said, what is the role of gender in making of these habitats? So, uh, out of all the case studies that all the families I talk to, the main of the family mainly focuses mainly focus family builds the monetary support system of the family, like they travel out and find occupation in the cities and bring the money, while the women also tries to support the family, but uh, they basically look at the domesticities, they form the domesticities while taking a practices to support their families. But as I mentioned, the family, the Mangarudi family, their original occupation was snake charming, but now they have lost their jobs because of all the fertilizers and all have come up. So now they have lost their jobs. So the they kind of keep finding new occupations, so and indulge in new practices in the cities. So yeah, and as it would be very interesting to, as Prasad said, that it would be very interesting to think about how the body adapts to the transience, the process of transience. Yeah, I will think about it. It would be very interesting.
Maitri?
What Kush said about the zoom in and zoom out of the gamer and life in a metropolitan city. So I think these looking at by looking at the examples which I studied, I think these runaways are trying to fill the spaces which are not assigned for anything. So it they are changing on a frequent basis. So as Sarovar asked, can a road be a home? So yes, that might be a home for someone and at some stages of their life, not for like a longer period of time. But yeah, I'll think through this on and yeah, I'm still thinking about it.
Swagat?
Yeah, for me, the idea behind interviewing a certain set of people was to uh, basically interview pairs of roommates from different locations uh, coming together who have experienced more than one transition from their parental home to uh, compare their ideas of home that they carry with them. Uh, and as I explored more, the complexities became apparent that that always existed, which generally goes unnoticed, or we choose to ignore it because of the temporality of the space. Uh, yeah, and gendered spaces and transgression was one of the aspect of the research which came out of the interviews. And yeah, I think it plays a major role. I should explore more about that. Also, the idea of student home is only temporary, looking through the lens of an individual, but the space itself is actually a permanent home which lacks the aspect of personalization.
Thank you, Swagat. Is there any comment or anything that Rupali has already put it in the? So Rupali?
I just wanted to say that, often transience, gets seen as, in some ways, there's an image to it. There's an image to, transience, and, and this question of whether it's out of choice or not. And, all of those come in. And there's almost this kind of image of lack that gets built, around transience. But I'm just kind of, and we're troubled by it, but there is as much, the settled life is as sort of troubling, you know and in that sense, what this panel kind of brings us is kind of troubling that idea of settling. It sort of reverses that, and troubles for us this idea of a settled life. And in that sense, and there are series of many examples of, when an image like that is seen, then there is a kind of uh, automatic sort of reversal that you need to settle people. And so you have all those kind of resettlement colonies, and policies to resettle, and all kinds of things that get built out of the image, or that this is kind of problematic. And so you kind of flip it around, and you settle it, and it's as troubling, and all of that. So I think that's one sort of trope that might be interesting to kind of think through, this idea of settling in various degrees. And the second, I think, interesting idea that this panel brings up is kind of expanding the idea of home. Home in its kind of multiple registers, and like the idea that the neighborhood becomes home, and there are multiple infrastructures that can constitute to the idea of home, rather than this closed sort of propertied idea of the home. So I think I might be useful to kind of think through these two tropes while we are kind of on this, in this discussion.
Any comment or any questions?
Yeah, I mean, I do have. I was wondering why is, and just the question, which is, why is the idea of home so necessary? In the sense that, a home can also be a very troubling idea, like you're saying, and it seems like people are all run away from homes all the time. So why the necessity of calling it a home? I mean, it's a question, not necessarily something that I suggest. But to think of maybe a new name or a new type or something. I mean, because it always becomes like, the neighborhood is the sort of, the home kind of extends. But sometimes it's okay to just not have a home. I mean, because I feel like the home also comes with the idea of, something that is settling and something that is sort of belonging and you kind of attached to something. But if it is about a movement, constant sense of movement, I mean, because I've been moving constantly, like I don't have a sense of home anywhere. Constantly sort of moving and always, wanting to be somewhere else all the time. So I don't kind of, I mean, it's not something that I'm looking for. So I mean, so I don't know what to call it anymore. And I was wondering why this, holding on to the home, it becomes so important. I mean, for some people it does, but maybe it's not.
I think, Prasad, sorry, Rupali, were you going to respond? Please do, and then I'll follow.
You can go ahead. I'll come back. Yeah.
It's interesting because I think since yesterday we've been looking at presentations, right, that have suspended the notion of home and provided us with different both dimensions, but spatialities and logistics of home. So and it's also an invitation to sort of think against a very normative category of a home, right? So I think it's the normativization of a home that each of these projects are able to invite us to think beyond. But it's also an invitation to each one of you as students to then grapple with are you returning to certain assumptions about what a home is, and hence your findings kind of return to certain conclusions, or are you thinking much more epistemologically, which is to say that, but what is the new understanding that I have gained in terms of my relationship, my subject position, and what I am researching? So I think that would be useful, as particularly the questions of subject position for each one of you who is grappling with this idea of home, unpacking it, and dispersing it, and pluralizing it for each one of us. But then return to it. That what is it? What is your stake in this question of what you are? Your starting point may be home. That I feel troubled by this concept of a home. But then what is your research allowing you to then claim? And so I think Prasad's point about sort of, whether naming it differently, but also arriving at a kind of an understanding of just being and living, and thinking through how that is a counter narrative to this very normativization of what we call life. And yeah, there's much more to talk about sort of normative categories of home and co-inhabitation or what have you. But also I just wanted to sort of emphasize that, choice making is still significant. I think we all come with a certain kind of privilege enough to be able to travel and then make several places our home, and then be able to live within networks that feel like home. So it's more of an experience as well, as much as it is a material kind of a network. But then what about those whose lives continue to be erased by these very normative categories of a home, or very colonial constructions of who is a nomad and who is a settled citizen of a place? So.
Really liking this.
Rohit? Yes, Rohit.
I think what Rupali was trying to suggest, and I think largely at sea, the trope of the home has emerged to turn the housing question around. from the idea of what housing is affordable to what can your home afford or what can your house afford. And there the term home becomes more useful because the house refers to the housing unit within housing practice, where the home becomes extended in this context. And I mean, the research on this panel, or the focus on this panel, to look at cases of varying temporalities are merely cases in that sense. But the idea is to kind of upturn the question, housing question around. What can your home afford? I mean, like what Prasad was talking about yesterday, Prasad Shetty was talking about yesterday or day before yesterday, is to ask the question about the self and not about the other. I mean,
Yeah,
just
Ashwin. Sorry, Rohit.
short response to that.
Yeah, Ashwin, you want to say something?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Just to continue the point, matlab, even in my thesis, the idea was that, and even Kush, when you pointed out being in the world, and what is to be in the world, and then what is to be in a place in the world. Actually, I was trying to look at what is to be in a place in the world, and then looking at that, there is a politics, and I don't know if I would actually, confidently be able to say that I have a choice to be in this house right now. So the idea of choice, I think, would be a little, uh, and that is why I was talking about this idea of a flow, where the ability to flow is actually what power is. And I think that is what the negotiation that a place affords is, what inhabitation or what being is. So uh, so I think being in a place kind of makes it uh, at one point in time, but the flow through time, through negotiations, through being in the world is what. And Prasad's comment on calling it home, I think it is just the associations that we build around it, through which we try to tie it to what we call home. So I think it is just the way people use it that makes the word important, and not the way we try to associate it with the house or with other things. Yeah, Rupali.
Just to kind of take off from that point, and what Prasad, like a home, of course, because we are kind of troubling this idea of the home, and so you kind of stay with that idea. But there can be series of metaphors to think the a home through, right? Like, for example, the nest has been used as the metaphor for the longest time to kind of think of the idea of the home. But the flight is kind of another way of thinking of the home, no? The nest versus the flight. And so how do you kind of open up these ideas of the home, which is not necessarily the settled, but and then you kind of think of various infrastructures that can then maybe kind of think of the ideas of the home as an extended idea. So in that sense, that, I mean, the idea of the home, but you're right, like we need to kind of think of different metaphors to kind of think of the home through.
I really, this Rohit's point really triggered my thing on, like in Bombay, there's the whole thing of housing, right? And how housing is, I mean, home, and Rupali's this thing is also very nicely put.
We're losing you, sir.
We lost Sarovar.
Sorry. I'll have to hold up my laptop. So this thing of one side, there is this thing of home, nest and flight. And then the other thing is this very uh, kind of sarkari thing of housing, the housing crisis of, and then there is also the builder lobby. And then there is this whole, I mean, I was thinking back to that, that early film of Mukul's on this colony that he had made, Mukul, Rohan Mukul, wala jo pehla film tha, I can't remember the name. And how he's taken these shots of the staircases and how people kind of feel home but kind of feel very displaced when when their housing problem has been solved. And I think that's also very it's nearly like a hard wall that hits you when you think of the context of homing in Bombay. And that's, yeah, just my brain is now functioning differently.
Prasad, you want to respond?
No, I was just thinking. I mean, it's like, you know, I don't know. I mean, I guess no one uses the word shelter anymore. I mean, I don't know what you know, that term implies. But what I mean, across the three students, right? There's a different sense of what. For now, we'll call it home. But what the sense of home is very different in all the three. You know, so I mean, it's actually a question to all three of you in the sense of how you want to. You know, work with the idea, right? Because I always felt like the sense of home has something to do with, you know, a certain rootedness and belonging, right? While also the idea of, you know, like everyone asks you what is your native home or whatever, like, you know, there's certain rootedness to it. While the individuals that each of you are studying, right, and it actually depends on who you're studying, right? Sometimes it might be that you know, the rootedness doesn't exist, or they wouldn't want that sense of rootedness. So you know, how that works out in individual cases is actually up to you. I mean, I don't know if there's a common answer to everyone. I think it depends. But what was interesting, I mean, what would be interesting is to think about what is the architectural form of this, you know, errantry in some ways, like this movement. Also from which maybe the idea of what you call it comes about. Yeah.
Any questions or a comment?
I mean, one thought I had was, you know, going back to what Rupali was saying, this propertied idea of home, right? And I you know, I want to sort of, I was dwelling on it in terms of it's both, you know, the projects are allowing us to discuss this this critique of this propertied notion of space or home, but also extending it to a propertied idea of people. And so, you know, the nomads are nomads because they've been taxonomized, they've been categorized, they've been kind of placed in a certain grouping, legally, illegally. There are all kinds of contestations and larger histories and longer histories to that project. To even sort of propertied idea of people cohabiting, so the policing of bodies that happens in hostels, or the policing of bodies that happens even in homosocial environments, whether it's all boys living together or women or girls choosing to live in a paying guest. So I think if one way to think about it is if Rohit says that, you know, that ultimately, because it's an architecture school and we're thinking of what is the larger housing question, or the notion of a right to housing, shelter, or what have you that emerges from it. Are there possibilities or ways in which we can imagine away from this very commodified logics of what a home is, and think more infrastructurally? Yes, that is the scale of architecture for me when I think about each of these stories and connect them back to the previous panel, but also the panel from last night. against the commodified logics of home and homing, as Sarovar was mentioning, what are the ways in which infrastructures can support a life? Coming back to Ashwin, when he was kind of going back to this idea of being in the world. So then what is the material infrastructure? And what is the architecture or architecting of that material infrastructure? That could be a possible way to sort of then think about, bringing back to Prasad's invitation to all of us today to think more spatially and architecturally, is where I am with it. It's not just about possession, dispossession, but an active critique of this commodified propertied logics of space, home, and even people.
Thank you, Kush. Thank you all of you for this wonderful session. Is there any more questions or comments or anything? So thank you very much, all the three presenters and all of the participants. This is a lot of things that we need to take from this conversation about the home and extension version of the homes that we are talking here. Thank you for the session, and the next session we will join back at 2:30. Now it's a lunch break, and then we'll meet again at 2:30. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, students. Thanks, Milind. Thanks all. Yeah.
Bye. See you.
Bye.